As was said, I am Chief of Staff at an organization called the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. We are based out of Washington, D.C., headed by bipartisan leadership, folks like former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, former Governor of Indiana Mitch Daniels, and Independent Tim Penny. And it's often the case when I travel outside of Washington, and which I'm all the more looking forward to doing these days. When I travel outside of Washington and just have those kind of informal conversations or meeting people and they ask you, what do you do for a living? And I tell them, I work for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And they kind of give me that like a little look there. And more often than not, unfortunately, they tell me, well, you're doing a great job. Thank you, everybody, for not saying that to me today as I've had those conversations. I'm going to talk to you about an idea today. We've been throwing around the word movement a lot today. I'm going to talk to you about an idea that I refer to as the meta-issue movement, and has to do with exploring how non-political reform groups and organizations might be able to help enact the change that we all seek in Washington. Now, to get there, I'm going to tell my own little personal story, and by story I mean, how does someone who helps lead a deficit reduction, national debt focus group in Washington find himself speaking to you at a Unite America summit that is focused on electing independents? Well, the story starts about 8 years ago. That's when I first started to become really passionate and interested about fiscal sustainability issues. I became interested in them for a variety of reasons, probably mostly because of the consequential nature of the issue. I'm not going to give you the full debt talk today and charts. That's for another day. But throw out a couple of stats. Look, we got $21 trillion in debt. We're going to see $1 trillion annual federal deficits return next year. We had those a few years ago. The difference this time is they're going to stay and remain permanently, as far as the eye can see, and grow to enormous levels. This is going to create a huge undue burden on our economy and future generations if we don't deal with it. So, hey, I was drawn to this because this is a huge issue, and I've been fortunate enough to earn a living working on this issue for about the last 7 years. Now, some of you might recall that about 6 years ago, despite how challenging dealing with this issue is, we actually came really close. This issue was hot in Washington. It was on the agenda. Okay? All the elements were there to fix it. The issue was on the agenda. You had well-vetted policy ideas. You might recall the Simpson-Bowles Commission that was mentioned at some point today. Okay? There were core members of Congress that were ready to go and work on this in a bipartisan way. There was huge outside support from important corners of society, including top Fortune 100 CEOs to local leaders across this country ready to stand up and support the tough choices that are going to have to be made to deal with our debt. Well, as we all know, that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, well documented. There's plenty of books that are written on it. Go check them out. But as myself, others that I work with on this issue have started to reflect on this the last several years. Certainly there's a lot of reasons why we haven't solved our debt problems. But one of the things we've been starting to realize and hypothesize is, you know what, the debt actually, I think, has come to symbolize and is a symptom of something much more fundamental. The debt has come to symbolize the brokenness of our political system, one that avoids tough choices, cannot achieve any bipartisan compromise, one that is focused on the short term at the expense of the long term, one that certainly is incentivizing partisanship over making progress on behalf of the American people. So as we've begun to come to that assumption, we kind of started our own journey here. Myself, other people I work with, starting to kind of look into, well, what is driving this hyper-partisanship and polarization that is destroying our political system? We started a journey, okay? And what I mean by that is we started reading, talking to people, convening experts and academics in all sorts of settings to find out what's driving our polarization and partisanship. And as you all know, there's a lot of factors that have driven that over several decades to find out, to get to where we are now. Then we started finding out about a variety of people's ideas on solutions, ranging from electing new types of candidates to addressing some of the structural problems in our political system, whether that be redistricting, campaign finance reform, electoral reforms, and others working on some of the cultural issues that are driving hyperpartisanship, from civility to dealing, frankly, with economic inequality, which I believe is a driver here too, to the media challenges that have driven this too. And then we were really happy to find out about, unbeknownst to us, before we went on this journey, the existence of numerous existing organizations and efforts that are actually working to address these problems, not the least of which is Unite America. So as part of this journey, we got to a point and realized something that I'm dubbing kind of the meta-issue conclusion, okay? The meta-issue conclusion has two parts to it. Number one is a conclusion I've come to and others that I've worked on this with that says, you know what? Our first passion and interest is the debt, but we can no longer treat separately the fundamental issue of dealing with our hyperpartisanship and polarization gripping our political system. And part number two is that, having realized that and realizing the budding movement that is out there, even though it's outside our core area of interest and mission, we might be willing to devote a small portion of our time, right, to working with others to address these challenges. Okay, now you're probably, okay, so what, right? I'm one person working on one issue in Washington where some of us are kind of reaching this conclusion. Well, I would pose to you, obviously, I'm not alone. And far from it, I would pose. We know that there's millions, I would say, around the country that are reaching a similar conclusion about our political system. And I would argue, more importantly, is a point of the meta-issue movement I'm trying to get to, I would pose that there are countless issue-focused, non-political reform organizations out there, right, that are also reaching a similar conclusion, right? This is just a few issues up here, but there could be a lot more. Issues that are just stuck in the gridlock in Washington, where the existence of solutions is no doubt out there, that perhaps could be tapped into to help accelerate this movement. One of the things that's been mentioned several times today, we know that this movement is starving for resources, both in terms of money and human resources, people, new converts. I would pose a ready source of them might be in all these non-political reform organizations that are advocating for issues that are stuck in the gridlock in Washington. Now that's a big, abstract idea, simplistic idea. So how do you even consider taking the next step on that, and what that might mean? I would pose to you two fundamental challenges that would have to be, at least two, fundamental challenges that would have to be addressed to even start thinking about this. Number one is this journey I talked about before, okay? For those that might be starting to consider kind of going on this journey, this is a really complicated journey for anyone that's done this. Trying to think about all this stuff, all right, and all these causes and solutions, and it is really complicated, incredibly time consuming. I think we got to figure out a way to, you'd have to figure out a way to condense this, create a home for people to be able to do this in a way that might be standardized so you can kind of accelerate that. So that would be idea number one. The second challenge would be just those institutional questions of mission creep. Isn't this like outside our core area of interest? What are we doing? We got to focus on our core mission, which, trust me, is completely understandable. I would argue that one's going to be very difficult to overcome, but one idea I would pose is I think you need examples of organizations out there starting to show the way to do that, and hopefully others will jump on board. So I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll close out this session just by posing to you to think about, like, what's your story here of how you've gotten here. There's certainly differences, I'm sure, from you than my story of how I got here to be standing here, but I bet you there's some similarities in terms of that journey that we've all gone on. And I'd pose to you that if you're affiliated or work with or volunteer with some other non-political reform organizations, feel free to kind of ask them their story and see where they are in this journey to test whether this big idea has any merit. So thank you, everybody.